That's your key mark. That's the mark.
Okay. Good morning. Boker Tov. Shabbat Tov, everybody. Cool for braving the clement weather to be here once again. Sorry? Right now it's beautiful outside. Yes, that's true. Hopefully it stays that way. Hopefully we'll go home dry as well.
Are we using the same source as last time?
The same booklet, yeah, but a double booklet. That should be fine. I'll just say something. So last week we were talking about Tefillot Shabbat. We'll carry on. We got through most of the Kabbalat Shabbat and Mariv, etc. We ended off talking about Magen Avot, about the bracha and Sheva. We had the discussion as to whether that bracha is said outside of a Bet Knesset or not. We saw the various opinions. What is considered a Bet Knesset? So it's interesting. I saw on Friday night in the Rinat Yisrael, which is always right. It says at the end of Mariv, in the Siddur, it says Ashliach Tzibur Omer, before Magen Avot, and then it says Ein Omrim Bracha Zo b'makom she'eino makom tefillah kvua. In other words, it doesn't say place is not a Beit Knesset. It says it's not a place is not a makom tefillah kvua, which is what we saw, that if you have, even if you have a garden minyan or a house minyan or different things where it is a well-established, permanent minyan there, one would say it. And it's not necessarily, as Ramosha said, not necessarily dependent on whether you have a Sefer Torah or not, etc. Okay, let's go. Let's pick up on page. So the beginning of the next year. So we'll pick up on page 229. 229 in the books. 229 in the PDF as well. And 229 in the corner, meaning it will be a shorter earlier page number.
I'm in the wrong place. Volume 16, Tefillot Shabbat.
Tefillot Shabbat is the one, yeah.
229 says 276. Oh, wait. It's a different numbering system.
Different numbering, but on the corner of the page, it will say 229. So we are moving now on to Shabbat day. We're moving on to Tefillat Musaf. Tefillat Musaf is obviously a unique prayer. The word Musaf means additional, it's extra. So we don't have Tefillat Musaf on a weekday. We only have it on Shabbat and on Yom Tov. Obviously this is corresponding to the Korban Musaf. Every day in the Beit HaMikdash was a Korban Tamid, brought in the morning and the afternoon, Tamid Shel Boker, Tamid Shel Ben Arbayim. That corresponds to Shacharit and to Mincha. What about Mariv? There's no Tamid of the night. That, as we discussed, Mariv corresponds to the extra limbs and parts of the Korbanot that were left over, that were burnt on the altar at night, and that corresponds to Mariv. That was one of the explanations why and how it's possible that if we do early Shabbat, if we daven earlier on Friday night, because in any event, I think it was the Magen Avraham who said, or maybe other Achronim, that since on Erev Shabbat, you could not wait until nightfall to bring those extra limbs on the altar, the Korban Tamid, obviously you can, that is going to take precedence over Shabbat. But those limbs would have to be brought earlier. And since it was brought earlier, it would make sense to daven Mariv earlier as well. Okay, but when it comes to Tefillat Musaf, so source number 1, page 229. Now the Gemara in Brachot essentially tells us that there are two different systems, two different opinions as to where the Tefillot come from. I've just explained corresponding to the different Korbanot. The Gemara also tells us they are corresponding to the Avot. Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Abraham instituted Shacharit, Yitzchak instituted Mincha, Yaakov instituted Mariv. The problem is, if you go according to the opinion, then it's based on the Avot. So where does Tefillat Musaf fit into that? You tell me maybe it's Keneged Yosef, I don't know. But says the Gemara, that is not the answer. The Gemara says that even if we say that the Avot instituted them, Chachamim later came and added in based on, or set it up based on corresponding to the Korbanot as well. And that is where Musaf, according to everybody, that is where Musaf comes from. That is parallel to that extra offering. Let's turn over the page. Let's see source number 2 in the Torah. And the Torah says, okay, telling us through the again, oftentimes you find, particularly in the Rishonim, but also in the Achronim as well, before everybody had a Siddur, or before you had everything laid out for us. So the poskim have to tell us how do we. Person who wrote the Siddur has to know where to put things and what's the order of Tefillot. So says the Torah, after we return the Sefer Torah in the morning, Yomash left Tzibur Kaddish, we say Kaddish, Yipalu Tzibur Tefillat Musaf, and then we daven Musaf. So what is Musaf? Shalosh Rishonot v'shalosh Achronot u'Kedushat Hayom ba'emtza. As we've discussed, the Shmona Esrei, it's a misnomer to call it the Shmona Esrei of Musaf, because It's no mitzvah ever call it the Shemona Esrei, but there are not 18 brachot at Musaf. There are only going to be already all the Tefillot of Shabbat. There are going to be 7. We have the first 3 brachot and the final 3 brachot, which are the same in every Amidah throughout the year. Okay, Sim Shalom or Shalom Rav, we change, but nonetheless, it's the same bracha. And the middle bracha is of Kedushat Hayom, relating to the Kedusha of Shabbat. ונוהגים בספרד לומר למשה ציווית, באשכנז נוהגים לומר תיקנת שבת, מיוסדת על א' ב' של תשרק, על שם הגאולה. So this is very interesting. I don't know if you've noticed this, but when we say Musaf, so in the bracha, the middle bracha that we say, right, all 4 tefillot of Shabbat, the middle bracha is related to Shabbat, but it's slightly different. So we say the way it starts off in Musaf is we say Tikanta Shabbat. You'll see it's in the Siddurim as well. I'm looking at the wrong one. In a moment. Yeah. So in many of the Siddurim it's printed. You'll see in the Rinat Yisrael, for example, Tikanta Shabbat v'atzita korbanoteh. The first letter of each word is in bold. That is because we are going in the order of Aleph Bet, but going backwards. So we start off with Tikanta with Tav, Shabbat Shin, Ratzita Resh, etc. So it's here in bold to show you that it's going according to that Aleph Bet. And why do we do that? Why do we go backwards? If you take the last few words, the last few letters of the Aleph Bet, and they spell out the word Tashlak, which means to whistle. So it says there's a pasuk in Zechariah that says, I will whistle and gather them in. That alludes to the Geulah, that alludes to the redemption, which is connected to Shabbat as well, and that is why the tefillah is arranged in that way with those words. Now the time for Musaf says the Mishnah, source number 4, Mishnah in Masechet Brachot, Shamusafin kol hayom, Rabbi Yehuda omer ad 7 sha'ot. So there are 2 opinions. Opinion of Tanna Kama says that Musaf can be recited all day long. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it's only until 7 hours into the day. Says the Gemara, V'shal Musafim kol hayom, number 5, Amar Rabbi Yochanan v'nikra posher. Even though we say that you could say Musaf the whole day, you're called a posher if you're going to wait until late in the afternoon, and then you're going to suddenly remember and say Musaf. That is not proper. That is not proper practice. Now, most of the time, yeah.
And then Musaf. You can say Musaf after Mincha. That's what I'm asking.
So we'll get to that. The discussion over here, the Rama talks about whether you could say Musaf, whether you could say Shachrit after Musaf even. But it's definitely not ideal. Let's put it that way. Okay, the poskim to discuss. If a person comes into the time where it's already time for Mincha, now it's time for Musaf, it's not so straightforward. But most of the time, this isn't really so relevant for us, because even if we have even if the Chazan's taking his time, you're still okay. You start davening at 8:30 in the morning. The time you get to Tefillat Musaf, you're fine. Where it does come a bit later is on Yomim Noraim, on Simchat Torah, etc. There's more of a question. We'll come to that. That also raises the question of, am I allowed to stop before Musaf and maybe make Kiddush, and maybe have something to eat, and then carry on? Okay, so we'll get to that in due course as well. Source number 6 is the Rambam. And the Rambam says, Tfilat Musafim zmanach ad Tfilat Shachar ad 7 shot ba'yom, i.e., the proper time to daven Musaf is after Shacharit until the 7th hour. והמתפלל אותה אחר 7 שעות, אף על פי שפשע יצא ידי חובתו מפני שזמנה כל היום. So it's best to daven within this time, but if you daven later, you've still fulfilled the obligation, but nonetheless, you are called a posher, acted negligently. As I said, we have to see if that applies to situation like Yamim Noraim as well, and we'll see why. But another interesting point, important point, which Tosfot makes over here, is the following. That we know, generally speaking, if a person, what happens if somebody missed a tefillah? Okay, you had for whatever reason, you had some sort of an honest, some sort of an extenuating circumstance, you were not able to daven, you forgot, whatever it is. So for first, we have a concept of tefillat tashlumin. Tefillat tashlumin means the tefillah which I missed. Or, let's say another example, let's say it was Rosh Chodesh, and a person forgot to say Yaleh v'Yavo, for example, in Shachrit or Mincha. Okay, the halacha is that if you left out Yaleh v'Yavo, you have to go back and you have to repeat it. And let's say, so this is a common case which could come up. Let's say Mincha, I forgot to say it, and I only remembered once it's already nightfall. So now I don't have time, and now I actually haven't davened Mincha because I left out. Okay, so Tashlumin is that the following tefillah I daven twice. I daven Amidas, 2 Shmona Esrei, and one is for the one that I'm davening at that time, and one is in lieu of the tefillah which I missed. So a person missed Shachrit, they daven Mincha twice, person missed Mincha, they daven Maariv twice, etc. What if you missed Musaf?
Yeah, you know, in that case, it's bottom, right? The reason you're saying again is going to say all of the other one, and Marvin not going to say it anyway because now it's Chodesh.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Okay, so it's not our topic now, but in the case of Rosh Chodesh, it's fascinating because let's say it's one day Rosh Chodesh. The person left out Yalev Yavo Mincha, and then I get to Maariv. So if I'm going to repeat, I'm not going to say Yalev Yavo again. But the point is like this: if I say that saying Yalev Yavo is an intrinsic part of Tefillah, and it's as if I haven't davened, so then I can daven afterwards. But that's a fascinating case. But what happens if one didn't say Musaf? So here the din is going to be different. Musaf is not like the other Tefillot. It says Tosfot in source number 7. Lo ba'im ta'av v'lo pelet Tefillat Musaf. If a person did not, this is based on the Gemara, which talks about Tashlumin. So it says if somebody didn't daven Mincha, etc. He says it doesn't say if you didn't daven Musaf. Because you cannot go then, right? The implication here as well is that Musaf could be daven after Mincha because we're relating to Maariv. But since Musaf is specifically and it's only corresponding to the Korban, it's the only reason why we say it. We'll see another nafkamina to come out of this as well in a moment. But therefore, the time for the Korban has passed. You can't say it. You can't say it anymore. So Musaf is something which is special. Musaf has its own din, and there is no tashlumin. He says later on, right? He says the principle is avar zvano batel korbano. The time is gone, and you cannot have the korban anymore. 3 lines from the bottom of page 231 says Tosfot. Aval shar tefillot alachmeininu. The other tefillot that we have, yes, they also correspond to the korbanot. But the principle is Rachmeininu. We are appealing for Hashem's mercy. And therefore, the Gemara says, the person could daven all day. That is why, when it comes to other korbanot, you can make it up after the time because it has that component of Rachmeinin that it's required. Now, where the other nafkamina of this is going to be, we'll get to it in a few pages, is when it comes to women davening Tefillat Musaf. Because when it comes to Tefillah, one of the, you might say, certain aspects of Tefillah would be considered. We have a set time. We have a set. It might be a mitzvah asesha zman grama under certain parameters, meaning time bound mitzvah. But nonetheless, poskim say that part of the function of Tefillah is rachmeinin. Where everybody needs to daven for mercy. Men need to daven for mercy. Women need to daven for mercy as well. And since that is a part of the component of Tefillah, therefore women are obligated in Tefillah as well. I'm not getting now into one of the earlier volumes. There's a long discussion in terms of what is a woman's obligation in Tefillah. It doesn't correspond to a man's in terms of actually davening Shachrit and Mincha. What about Maariv? Is it just one Tefillah a day, but there's not the obligation of the formal nusach and the formal formula that we have? Okay, that is a machlokta poskim. Not getting into it now, but everybody agrees that there is some form of obligation of Tefillah for a woman as well because of this concept of that we need to ask for mercy. So, but we'll come back to that. Going back to just finishing our current topic, source number 8, Shulchan Aruch. He says, "Man tefillat musaf miyad achar tefillat hashachrit." The time for musaf is straight after shachrit. Ve'en la'achra yoter mi'ad sof zayin sha'ot. One should not delay it past the end of 7 hours. Ve'im itpalel oto achar 7 sha'ot nikra posher, as we've seen. Ve'af al pi chen yatzai yedei chova mnei shezmana kol hayom. B'diavad, the time is the entire day. If the entire day passed and you did not have a musaf, you can't make it up. You can't make it up later. The Ramah, by the way, says, that if you had daven, I'm not sure why you would do this. Well, I'll say in a moment why you would do it. But if one daven musaf before shachrit, you have fulfilled your obligation. The case might be a person comes very late to shul. Okay, we'll see what the poskim say about that. But a person comes very late to shul and he has not yet daven shachrit, and he sees that Tzibur is starting to daven musaf. Okay, so if he davens with them, he has fulfilled his obligation of musaf. Is that what he should do? We'll see in a moment. Says the Shevet HaLevi, however. Now we've seen in the Rambam, we've seen the Shulchan Aruch, we saw the Gemara already, that if you daven musaf after 7 hours of the day, you are called a posher. Nobody wants to be called a posher. It's negligent, it's criminal in modern Hebrew, right? But so what about on Yom Kippur and on Simchat Torah? Normal Simchat Torah, hopefully not like the experience we had this year. But you're dancing, you have the hakafot, you have the kiddush, whatever. By the time you get to Musaf, it's already quite late in the day. Does that make you a posher? So says the Shevet HaLevi, source number 9. He says, "Achanami, b'didan denekra posher, en utzon olama posher mezid, en mit'atzer." So he says the word here posher means a few different things. In our case, does not mean the one who is willfully negligent. It means somebody who's lazy. You're lazy because you just didn't. You had the whole day to do it, and you didn't. We find this in a number of places. In Chazal where they tell us, maybe specifically for our generation, where you have a mitzvah, you have an obligation which has a set time, but there is a long window in which to do it. Because I always say, don't wait until the last minute. What happens when you wait till the last minute? Everybody waits till the last minute. Something comes up at the last minute, and before you know it, you haven't done it. So by Kriyat Shema, for example, the first Mishnah in Shas tells us that when is the latest time to say Kriyat Shema? At nightfall. There is an opinion that says a certain part of the night. There is an opinion that says until Chatzot, until halachic midnight. And there is an opinion that says you can say it until the morning, to Alot HaShachar. Kriyat Shema Shel Arvit can be said at night, can be said the entire night. And then the Gemara says, actually, there's not really a machloket between them, but Chachamim said ad chatzot, meaning they agree that you can fulfill the obligation, if you say it until before daybreak. But they didn't say that. Why? Because if we tell people you can do it until daybreak, they're going to wait until daybreak and they're going to miss it. You tell them you can do it until chatzot. So when they do it half an hour after Chatzot, they've still fulfilled their obligation. And the Gemara says, person comes home, what a person's going to say, I'm going to eat a little bit, I'm going to rest a little bit, and then they'll come, they'll say Kriyat Shema, and what happens? You fall asleep on the couch, and you wake up, and it's too late. So we find this theme very often, because they don't want us to wait. It's good advice. They don't want us to wait till the last minute to do things, and therefore they imposed certain fences, certain restrictions, to do things earlier. So yeah, you tell people you can daven Musaf the whole day, you wait until late in the day. Meaning you're lazy, you're negligent in that way. But if you did it later, not because you were lazy, but because you were standing davening the whole morning, okay, you were doing dancing hakafot. Okay, that's not a problem. Says the Shevet HaLevi, says in bold. In Kembe, Yom Kippurim, the Machrim, that's Lord. Yom Kippur, you might get to depends which minyan you're in, but you might get to your Musaf very, very late, not out of laziness. Because you're doing the avodah, the service of the day. Shal tzibur, shachrit, you're davening shachrit. Simchat Torah as well. We don't need to be concerned with this. Nonetheless, Mishnah Berurah, source number 10 says shum korban lekatchila lekorban tamid shel shachar b'diavad yatzar. All right, so that's relating to the previous point we said that you should still daven things in order. Shachrit first and Musaf afterwards. That was like the question we mentioned. If a person comes late into shul, nonetheless he should still first say Shachrit and only then he should daven Musaf. That's the Minchat Yitzchak in source number 11. Talks about that. Source number 12, the Piskei Teshuvot says there are different reasons as well. There are mystical reasons as well about keeping our tefillah in order, and therefore one should do that. The other place this comes up, very common question, in some places, so I'm told, that if somebody comes late to shul and they aren't able to say the whole order of Psukei de Zimra, right? So the main part of tefillah b'tzibur, I think I've mentioned this before, but not everybody knows. When we say tefillah b'tzibur, a lot of people think you're talking about answering Baruch Hu and answering Kaddish. Those are important things. And that's what's called a davar shebikdusha, meaning it can only be said with a minyan. If a person's davening by themselves, without a minyan, 9 people are davening together, that is called davening by yourself, because that's not a minyan. I remember, Mark, I have to apologize, I'm going to mention COVID again. But I remember during the days of COVID, so there was a time, I think here it was different, but in England, so there was one of the lockdowns, I don't remember now which one, but there were different times where different things were open, essential services were allowed to stay open, and there was always a question, places of worship. So communal places of worship for communal prayer was closed, but people were allowed to come for individual prayer. The reason was not because of us, but because in other religions there's a certain, they had a certain value in terms of coming to pray in the place of worship, even by themselves. So there were shuls who followed the rules, And there were shuls who followed the rules in the following way. They said the shul will be open for individual prayer at such and such a time, and 10 people are, welcome to come and begin their individual prayer, at the same time. But the point is, so Davar Shebikdusha is something which Kaddish, Kedusha, Baruch Hu, etc. We need a minyan to be able to say that, in order to give us license to be able to say those things. But you've given Midot Sharachamim, for example, but that is not Tefillah B'tzibur. Tefillah B'tzibur, communal prayer, is the Amidah, right? And it's the silent Amidah with 10 people at least, who are standing and praying together, praying on their own, but at the same time, that is what's called Tefillah B'tzibur. So the question is, if somebody comes late, and I'm in shul, and I'm going to hear Kaddish, and I'm going to hear Baruch Hu, and I'm going to hear Kedusha and everything, but I'm still saying Sfedi Zimra, Kriyat Shema, whatever it is, when everybody's standing and saying the Amidah, so I'm actually missing Tefillah B'tzibur. So the question is, what do I skip, or how much do I skip in order to come and in order to make up the time to start the Amidah together with everybody else? Sometimes it's a question not because you come late, but just because you can't keep up, right? That happens as well. And so the question is, number one, what are the things which I'm allowed to skip and that I should skip, and if I'm skipping, then after the Amidah, should I go back and say those things again? So obviously the best thing to do is to come on time, or to come early in a way where one is able to say everything and don't have to skip. But there are those who say, and I think the more mainstream approach is that you would skip certain parts. There are certain parts which are non-negotiable, right? Birkot, Kriyat Shema, etc. You can't skip. But certain things, certain parts of Sfedi Zimra, that we say one would skip in order to be able to reach Tefillah B'tzibur together. There are those, some of the more mystically inclined, who would say, even for the sake of that, don't skip. It's important not to say things out of order. But so we find this tension that exists throughout. But there are both revealed reasons and mystical reasons why there is a specific order in the words of the Tefillah, and therefore that is why we say Musaf. It should be Shachrit first and Musaf second. Okay.
What's the bottom line of that? The person comes to shul and Hashkama Minyan is just starting Musaf. And can he daven the Musaf and then go to another minyan and start Shabbos? Is it permissible?
So source number 11, the main Chayyitzchak says that no, you shouldn't do that. You should go and you should daven Shachrit with Tzibur first and get to Musaf later. That's okay. We mentioned the question of women's obligation regarding Musaf. So now on page 234, the Tzlach, which is also known as the Nodav Yehuda, he writes in his commentary on Masechet Brachot the following. He says, "Lachen ani omer שכיוונו במה שאני מסתפק עם תפילת המוספים נוהגת בנשים, שהיא מצווה שהזמן גרמה." On the one hand, we see that Tefillat Musaf has a specific time. It's a positive mitzvah, has a specific time. We said until 7 hours of the day or until the whole day. That's still time. V'af shetfilah imenat like midrabanan, even though this is only midrabanan, not midoraita. V'dat Tosfot gam mitzvot rabanan shazman gam anashim ptulot. Okay, so Tosfot says that this principle of the exemption for women of the mitzvah asay shazman grama applies to rabbinic mitzvot as well. Ella, so that's the one side. As we explained, that we have an obligation of tefillah, not just because of the time, but because we need to ask for mercy, which applies to everybody. So he says here, okay, now you might tell me, well, that which you say where you ask for your needs in tefillah is something you only do on the weekday. But on Shabbat and Yom Tov, we don't. We have different tefillot. Just nonetheless, that's still part of tefillah. It's still part of, since it's intrinsically part of the chiyuv of tefillah, it would apply on both. כמו שכתב רבנו יונה כאן, לעניין תשלומים בתפילה שלאחריה, אבל בתפילת מוסף שאיננה לך מכמבואר, אין לה תשלומים. As we said before, right, when it comes to musaf, the fact that Musaf is intrinsically different from all the other tefillot. That's why we don't have tashlumin for Musaf. Musaf's not about Bayirachmin. It's about the fact that it's corresponding to the Korban, to the specific time, and therefore, says the Tzlach, in Tzvat Aseh D'Rabanan Shazman Gama, Vadai Denashim P'turot L'dat HaTosfot. He says, according to this, a woman would be exempt completely from davening Tefillat Musaf. Now, first of all, we'll see that that's a machloket. But the second question to ask is if women are exempt from davening Musaf, are they allowed to daven Musaf if they wish to? Okay, so we'll see that as well. But first of all, according to this opinion, Rabbi Akiva Eiger expands further. He says, interesting svara. He says, he says, I'll give you a further reason why a woman would be exempt from Musaf. We know we're coming up soon to the Arba Parshiot, Shabbat Shkalim, right? So everybody had to give the half shekel, which would go and be a contributor to the fund, from which the korbanot tzibur, the public offerings, would be purchased. Not everybody had to give. It was only men over the age of 20 who would have to give. So women were exempt from giving that, and therefore he says since the korban, since Musaf is related to the korban, and women are exempt from contributing towards the public fund for the korbanot, that is another reason why they would be exempt. Interesting. I wasn't aware of this before I saw. Shut Rabbi Akiva Eiger quotes a support for this. He says, "Chen mashma be'tshuvat besamim rosh." It's very interesting that Rabbi Akiva Eiger quotes the Besamim Rosh. Besamim Rosh is a sefer that was written, that was supposedly by a Talmud of the Rosh, the great Rishon Rabbeinu Hasher, and it was meant to be the different unpublished responsa and positions that were held by the Rosh. It was later discovered to be a forgery, and that's now it's referred to as, they refer to it as Kitzvei Rosh, not Kitvei Rosh, not the writing of the Rosh, but Kitzvei Rosh, meaning the forgery, the faker of the Rosh. It's generally accepted now today. I don't know when it was revealed or uncovered that it was faked, but it's generally accepted to be a forgery. In any event, but Rabbi Akiva Eiger says this for himself, that maybe that's another reason why women would be exempt. Now, Rabbi Yitzchak HaChaim Spector, on the next page, he disagrees. He has, as I told you, this is a machloket, and he has a different opinion. He says, let's read inside quickly. He says, I don't think this svara is very good. כל כהן ששוקל אינו חוטא, כי על פי דין פטורים הם המשקלים, וכן לוויים, כמו שכתב בשער המלך. Says not only women who are exempt from giving the מחצית השקל for the korbanot, also the kohanim, also לוויים, also וכן קטנים, דפטורים. עד כהנים ולוויים קטנים פחותים בין כף יפטרו מוסף. Have we ever heard that Kohanim, that Leviyim, that those who are under the age of 20 would be exempt from davening Musaf? We've never heard such a thing. Heard a week or two ago, very interesting. Shechter was in Israel. He gave a shir. He spoke about some of the dinim of Milchama. So he spoke about the fact, again, this is Parshat Shkalim. Afterwards, we have Parshat Zachor, and there's discussion who is obligated to hear Parshat Zachor. Zachor is related to remembering Amalek. So there's a Sefer Chinuch and Minchat Chinuch discussed whether women would be required to hear Parshat Zachor, since women are exempt from waging war, and therefore may be exempt from hearing the Parsha. That as well as a machloket. And there was a Sefer, there was Rav Shlomo Cohen of Vilna, who actually had an interesting svara which he wrote. He wrote it in the introduction to his book, in the table of contents, and then in the end he ended up not writing the siman. I don't remember who it was that advised him not to write it, but he said that there was an opinion that Kohanim were exempt from the war as well. Again, that's the discussion. There are proofs this way and that way. This was a big question actually during, I think it was in World War I in England, and the Beit Din of London and of Leeds were fought to this question because they were Kohanim and claimed they could be conscientious objectors, not conscientious, but claimed that they could have an exemption from religious reasons, etc. But so he says there that since Kohanim are exempt from serving the army, then the Kohanim would be exempt from hearing Parashat Zachor as well. And therefore, if you had a Kohen who was the Baal Koreh, he could not, if he's exempt, he can't discharge other people their obligation. Okay, Alach Alamaisa, we've never heard of it. Nobody else has ever said such a thing. Fascinating approach. But it's reminiscent of this. So he says, if the fact that you're patur from shkalim, but there are many other people who are exempt from that as well. Kohanim, Leviim, those under the age of 20. Again, those under the age of 20, it's not a katan, it's not a child well over bar mitzvah, but we've never heard that they would be exempt from musaf. And even if you say, he says, you might say the katanim are different because ultimately they will reach the age of 20 and they will become obligated, and therefore they should still be included. Nonetheless, in bold, he says, El al kochach, muchach. Completely rejects this point of Rabbi Kenigsberg. He says it's got nothing to do one with the other, and therefore nashim chayavot, and women should be exempt. Sorry, just checking you're listening. Women should be obligated in tefillat musaf. וכן מסתימת הפוסקים, נשים חייבות בתפילה, לא חילקו בין מוסף ושאר תפילות. We don't make a distinction between the different tefillot. The Kilat Yaakov has a slightly different approach over here, but the bottom line is that we see two different opinions. The Mishnah Berurah in source number 17 over the page, he says Tfilat Musafin Batzlach Katav V'Torot Aval B'Sefer Magen Gibun Pasak T'Chayavot Ayen Sham. So he does not appear to conclude one way or the other, but there are those who say that women are exempt from Tfilat Musaf, those who say they are not. The Hilchot Yosef points out, you can see there are, again, this is a machloket amongst Achronei Zmanenu as well. But what he points out, and Rav Melamed points out as well, is that Nashim P'turim Mitfilat Musafin Shel Shabbatot B'Yamim Tovim V'Roshei Chodashim. So according to Hilchot Yosef, Rav Yitzchak Yosef, Rishon LeZion, he says that according to Sfardi, that women would be exempt from Musaf, but nonetheless, Tov Yishmot Tfilim Pi Shlach Tzibur, they can hear from the Chazan if they wish. U'mikom Makom, Im Mitpalot Musaf, Ein Limchot B'Yadayim Sheyesh Lehem Mamash Yismochu. Since there are those who say that they are required to say it, if they want to recite Musaf, that is okay. Now, that is more of a chiddush for the Sfardim. For the Ashkenazi poskim, again, this goes back to the question of mitzvah tasei shazman grama, where you have a positive time-bound mitzvah, which a woman is exempt from. Are they allowed to fulfill the mitzvah? And are they allowed to say the bracha? The Ashkenazi accepted normative Ashkenazi practice is that even if women are exempt, they can fulfill the mitzvah. This is based on the idea that it says Gadola mitzuveh v'oseh misheino mitzuveh memser. The Gemara tells us that somebody who's obligated gets a greater reward for fulfilling something than somebody who is not obligated if they do it anyway. So the Rishonim write, there's a greater reward, but there's still a reward, meaning even though you're not obligated, one can still fulfill it. And therefore, Ashkenazi woman would say a bracha. When an Ashkenazi woman wants to take a lulav, for example, and say a bracha, there is no question, no problem with that. Even though there's no obligation to do so. The Sfardi Psak is a little bit more reticent on this. They will say, no, you're not obligated. You shouldn't say the brachot. So you might think, when it comes to Musaf, if there's a doubt as to whether there is an obligation or there's no doubt and they are exempt, then maybe they're not allowed to. But says Hilchot Yosef, no, this is not like other mitzvot tasei shazman grama. If a woman wants to say Musaf, she can. There's no problem. Certainly, according to Ashkenazi Psak, a woman wants to say Musaf, she can, and there is no problem with that. And according to some poskim, there may even be a chiyuv. Okay. What about if Musaf is going to take place very late, and we want to eat a little bit before Musaf? So this comes up in Rosh Hashanah as well. In many places, there's a minhag, especially with the tefillah, it's very, very long. So after Shafrit, they would stop and have a kiddush. Rosh Hashanah, it's a more complicated issue because there's also the question of eating before Tkiyat Shofar, which I'm not going to get into now. Yom Kippur, obviously, there would not be a kiddush. But Simchat Torah is somewhere else where it comes up as well, when the Hakafot are going to go on for very long, and one may want to stop, have something to eat in order to carry on. So, what?
Also, because the fast, right? Unless it's too late, if you eat something, there's fasting.
You're saying there's a question about fasting on Shabbat. That's also true, and that you don't want to, right? But now we're talking in terms of just eating before tefillah. So we'll see that Musaf is not as stringent as Shachrit in this regard. Shulchan Aruch number 20, page 237 at the bottom. He says, Mutar lit'om kodem tfilat musafim. Again, the word here lit'om is significant. It doesn't mean to eat. So we're not going to sit down and have a full sit-down meal. Although some kiddushim, depending where you go, that it may feel that way. But Mutar lit'om kodem tfilat musafim. You can taste some food before Musaf. Daino achinat perot afilu pat mu'at He says you can eat fruit, you could even eat some bread, even enough that's going to say sheit one. Aval suda asur, not to have a full meal. Now, again, the added complication here is that when we need to have kiddush. So it says them again, when we have kiddush, you know that this makes it even more complicated because kiddush has to be b'makom suda. You can't. So you say you can eat, but you can't have a full suda. But you have to have kiddush, which has to be makom suda. So it has to be enough food that's going to be considered a suda for the sake of kiddush, but not considered a suda for the sake of having a meal. So we see a little bit of the tension here. Says them again, Abraham, in source number 21. He says, "Avagav de'asor le'achol kodem kiddush ve'in kiddush ela b'makom suda." Right, and this is why, by the way, some people, some are very stringent on this. That they would any time when they would make kiddush on Shabbat morning, they wouldn't have kiddush without washing bread and having a motzi in order that it is a proper suda. We are often rely on. We'll get to Hilchot kiddush a little bit later on. I'm going to jump the gun too much, but we often rely on, certainly in the morning, the opinion that even mezonot would be enough and that would satisfy the requirement for kiddush b'makom suda. There are some places, particularly in the winter, when they have, you find this in Chutz La'aretz as well, you have a chicken soup kiddush on Friday night in shul or something like that before you go home. So there it's a little bit more complicated. On Friday night, for various reasons, which we'll get to discuss kiddush, to rely on the fact that anything less than hamotzi, anything less than a full meal is kiddush b'makom suda. It's not as straightforward, but there are those who rely on it in case of need. But yeah, we're talking about in the morning before Musaf. So says the Magen Avraham, although you can't eat before Kiddush, and Kiddush has to be with the Suda. He says, nonetheless, over here, we can rely on the fact that you drink the cup of wine of Kiddush, that is enough for your meal. In other words, to make it enough of a meal for Kiddush Makom Suda. He says, alternatively, you could just eat a little bit, and then you daven musaf, and afterwards, if you eat bread in the same place, that would still be considered kiddush makom suda. Yeah, but generally speaking, once one has, so he doesn't mention them again, Abraham, but generally speaking, one has a little bit of mezonot, and we would rely on that, and that would be enough for a kiddush makom suda. Source number 23, Shmirat Shabbat, quotes the number of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Says naog la'akel b'minei talgima, by different types of mezonot. Lechol afili yoter mikabetza. Even if you eat more than a kabetza, b'vatim zeh barabim, the mid kalei hadadi. Again, the main problem over here of eating a meal before musaf is, again, it's one of those things relates to what we said earlier in the shir. Person's going to sit down, they're going to have a meal, they're going to get, you know how it is, the meal goes on and goes on and goes on, and then you're not going to, you don't want to be a posher. You're going to end up not forgetting to daven musaf. So if you're there, people are around, and they're going to remind each other, particularly if it's at shul, you're not going to forget, hopefully, to go back up and daven musaf, and therefore that would be okay. There is one more point here, which I won't read inside, but he talks about when it comes to kohanim, that if you have kohanim, the reason why we have Birkat Kohanim in Shachrit and we don't have it in Mincha is because then, and this is why in Chutz La'aretz as well, in Simchat Torah, so Ashkenazi communities in Chutz La'aretz, as you know, don't say Birkat Kohanim throughout the week. They only say Birkat Kohanim on Yom Tov and only at Musaf. The reason is because there has to be Birkat Kohanim has to be mitoch Simcha. Generally speaking, Ashkenazi communities were not able to be. I mean, it's a joke, but it's true. Think of all the persecutions and the situation in which they were living. They were not able to. It's only on Musaf of Yom Tov that we have the double Simcha that we're able to get to that point, with one exception, that on Simchat Torah the Birkat Kohanim is done in Shachrit and not in Musaf. Why? Because you're having Kiddush and everybody's eating and everybody's drinking, and the Kohanim are not allowed to go up to Ducha if they've had a certain amount of wine. So there's a chashash of shichrut, and therefore it's done before. So there's a whole question over here. And Hilchot Yosef discusses if a Kohen is going to have a Kiddush, how much wine is he allowed to drink in order still to be able to go to the Birkat Kohanim. You're not going to forgive me. I'm going to mention COVID again, but this was very interesting because this question came up. So when we had the first Simchat Torah back after COVID, there was still lots of restrictions, and there was no food allowed. Right, shul had to be very, very short. We couldn't elongate the tefillah. There was no food or drink allowed on premises. So somebody came up to me. It was my first Simchat Torah in Chutz La'aretz. I wasn't even used to it. I was used to the fact that it was Birkat Kohanim all the time, and then I forgot about the fact that Birkat Kohanim now was only in Shachrit. So he came up to me and he said, "Well, shouldn't we do it at Musaf? There's there's no food, so there's no chashash, so we shouldn't do it." So afterwards, it's actually a machloket achronim in terms of what should be done. So I said, okay, makes sense. It's good, it's a good svara. So we didn't say Birkat Kohanim at Shachrit. We did it at Musaf. Afterwards, somebody else said, no, maybe we should have done it earlier. I don't know, whatever. And I wasn't sure. I spoke to another rabbi afterwards from a nearby shul, and he said to me, yeah, we said it at Shachrit, but I felt the whole tefillah that we should have said it at Musaf. So anyway, what then turned out, and somebody said to me, you're not worried that the Kohanim are going to come and have their own hip flasks or whatever it is. Turned out that despite the regulation that there was no food allowed on premises, there was some alcohol that was consumed. So anyway, the next year we went back and did a Shabbat. In any event, so that is okay. Going back to Shabbat. So we're now up to Mincha. We've gone through Shachrit, we've gone through Musaf, we've had our Kiddush, before Musaf, after Musaf, whatever. We'll talk more about the Kiddush in future Shurim. And now we're up to Mincha. So page 242. So the Kolbo, who's one of the Rishonim, tells us, so during the week, we begin Mincha just with Ashrei, and we go into the Amidah. On Shabbat, we have Ashrei and Uva Letzion. Now, it's not that we're adding in an extra tefillah that we don't normally say. We're moving the Uva Letzion, which is at the end of Shachrit. We're saying it at the beginning of Mincha. Why did we not say Uva Letzion in the morning? Jeremy, you're going to like this. Meaning, I'll explain in a moment why you like it. But we're saying there are people that are at home, there are elderly, there are pregnant women, there are nursing, etc., who are waiting for us to come home so that we can say Kiddush, because they're fasting until they can't eat, until they've heard Kiddush, etc. So he says, if we're going to spend too long in shul, then they're going to have to wait, and that would not be appropriate. Therefore, we shorten the davening in the morning so that we can get home and we can make Kiddush and we can have lunch. Okay, now
it's pretty arbitrary. Like the Letzion is going to be
but so here's the point. You're saying Uva Letzion, right? In many shuls nowadays, you rattle it off in 10 seconds, 20 seconds. You can't go Uva Letzion. I think the schoolboy is a proof that once upon a time they used to spend a lot more time saying it. They would sit and they would say with Kabbalah. If we're saying we're cutting it out because of Torah Chatzibur, maybe that's a smach to say that we should spend a little bit more time saying this tefillah. Okay. Told you would like it. Very good. So Jeremy's happy. Now we can move on. What? No, in the afternoon, everybody's having a shlof, they've eaten, they're okay. No, you get to Sudash Lishit. Well, later on, we're going to get to Kiddush, we're going to get to Sudat Shabbat. Sudash Lishit, it's one of those things that says in the poskim, a person has to be careful, think how much they eat. You have to remember, you're going to have Sudash Lishit later on. Don't stuff yourself fully. This is a very difficult halakha to keep. Don't stuff yourself too much at lunch. You've got to leave room so that you're still hungry later on. Okay, but most people are not hungry when we get to Sudash Lishit. So then we say Vani Tefillah. Again, there's a discussion here of the Kolbo as to why that Tefillah is said. We read from the Sefer Torah. We read from the next week's parsha. The Mishnah Berurah over here, source number 29, explains why it is that we say Kaddish in the morning when we have Kriyat Torah. So we say Chatzi Kaddish at the end of Kriyat Torah, the Chazan or whoever says it at the Bima. Over here in Mincha, we don't say it there together with the Torah reading. We say it afterwards, just before the Amidah. So says the Mishnah Berurah number 29. We never say Kaddish together with the Torah reading at Mincha. Kaddish over here is Chatzi Kaddish. Only later on, when we just before the Amidah. And that applies for after the Sefer Torah and for before for the Amidah, same Kaddish. Because if we were to say it after reading the Torah, well, then we'd have a problem. Because then we wouldn't say it again. Because you don't say Kaddish and then Kaddish with no hefsek in between. It's always better to have the Kaddish just before the Amidah. In Shachret, where you have Ashrei in between before Musaf, and therefore there's no issue of not having a hefsek. Okay, one more point. I think with this we'll conclude. We're not going to get to the mistakes in Tefillah. We'll talk about that next week. But we have the 3 psukim of Tzidkatcha, which we say at the end of Mincha. Tzidkatcha tzedek l'olam torah chaemet. צדקתך אלוקים אדמו"ר מאשר עשית גדולות, אלוקים מכמוך, צדקתך כרעיה משתחת המבע, וממה תושיע השם. That is the Ashkenaz Nusach, Edut HaMizrach, have a slightly different order, it's the same psukim. So Sefer Abu Draham gives us one of the reasons, somewhat mystical reasons why we say this. These are psukim relating to Tziduk Adin. Tziduk Adin, justification of Hashem's judgment, so to speak, which is something that we do at times of mourning. So he says, יש אומרים שנהגו לאומרם, כמו צידוק הדין, על פושעים שעתידין לחזור לדינם, אחר השלמת הסדר, הם מצדיקים את הדין על דינם החוזר. That, again, whatever it means, that the neshamot of the pushim, of the sinners, of those who are in Gehinnom, get a bit of a respite. They get Shabbat out. But as they say in the army, right, l'kol Shabbat yesh motzei Shabbat. Every Shabbat comes motzei Shabbat. Afterwards, and on motzei Shabbat, so Gehinnom opens up again, whatever that means, and therefore it's related to that we say this justification of the judgment. This malach comes on Erev Shabbat, says, okay, time's up, you get to go home for the weekend. You can rest just as Israel are keeping Shabbat. Motzei Shabbat machliz omer chazur poshim leGehinnom. When we finish Shabbat, so too those neshamot have to go back into Gehinnom. That's one reason that is brought, one mystical reason in Abu Draham. Another reason why we say Tziduk Adin at the time of Mincha, says the Torah, maybe a historical reason, is that a number of tzaddikim passed away at this time on Mincha of Shabbat. He says, נוהגים בכל המקומות למד פסוקים של צדקתך, וכתב אבשלום הטעם, שתקנו למד tziduk adin. Why? That Moshe Rabbeinu died at that time, Mincha time on Shabbat. We'll see in a moment a difficulty with that, which the Bach raises. But Shulchan Aruch Harav says not just Moshe, also Yosef and also David. So this is the time 3 great tzaddikim passed away, and therefore we say Tziduk Adin. Now the Bach says, wait a minute. He says, not so clear. How can you say that Moshe Rabbeinu passed away on Shabbat? Because we know it says in the Midrash the following. It says, "Vaday be'erev Shabbat met Moshe." Says the Bach in source number 34. It must have been on erev Shabbat when Moshe Rabbeinu died. Why? Right? He wrote 13 Sifrei Torah, one for each of the Shvatim, on the day that he died. Clearly, Moshe Rabbeinu did not write Sifrei Torah on Shabbat. It's impossible. So, about for a Torah by a guy, so he says that Moshe Rabbeinu died on Shabbat, on Erev Shabbat, and then it was on Shabbat itself. That's when he was buried. He was buried by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, B'chvudo B'atzmo. Ad hayom hazeh, nobody knows where the burial place of Moshe Rabbeinu is. And of course, Tzidkatcha, whenever we don't say Tachanun, if it would be correspondingly on a weekday that we would not say Tachanun, of course on Shabbat we never say Tachanun, but if it correspondingly on a weekday we would not be saying Tachanun, then we would not say Tzidkatcha either. That is what the Shulchan Aruch says in number 35. So אומרים Tzidkatcha im chalbo yom she'ilo hayachol lo hayom embo mincha nefilat apayim, then אין אומרים Tzidkatcha. The Sfardim have a slightly different a different parameter in terms of when it is or is not said. And I think as we said before, most of the time the machlok is to have a fight about whether you say it or not. And then by the time that's over, it's time to have Kaddish. Okay, Ad Kan, that is in terms of Mincha. We still have to get through Mariv of Motzei Shabbat. There's a little bit to talk about mistakes. What happens when one makes mistakes in the Amidah in terms of Tashlumin as well? We mentioned no Tashlumin for Musaf. Would there be Tashlumin for Shabbat, for other things? So we'll leave that for next week. Following on from that, we'll get to a little bit about Shnai Mikra and Kriyat Torah and Shabbat. And that will take us to the final share of volume 16, and we'll begin volume 17, which is has been published, taking us through to Hilchot Kiddush, Sudot Shabbat, etc. So good day, everybody. Have a good week. Thank you all for coming.
I don't think it's worried too much about the symbols going back to the hidden. Once he comes back, he'll be wrong. Is there the original? Go to the plug store. Let's see.
Then again, I can't remember what he said. So the question was asked. I said that they go back to, all right, who's